Can you,
Is there a question? Karen?
yes, regarding that Bruce Anderson, can he show up and be counted as present and then disappear?
Yeah, I question that too. I don't know.
That's a good point.
Or somebody signed in for him, but I don't know. I don't know, but I just want to make sure before I put anything out.
Okay.
I follow. I don't know.
All right, Jonathan, welcome. I see you showing up there too. So tonight we have our speaker, Nadia Opatz, who will be talking about her father's and his family, or his father's journey. But what's really interesting is, so I'm sitting there typing something about Nadia Opatz, and my husband looks at me and goes, "You know who that is, right?" Oh, no, I don't know who this person is at all. Yeah. Her mother was the piano teacher of two of my kids. She is a phenomenal pianist herself, and Tammy is just a delight. I'm like, no, oh my gosh, it is the same. So Nadia, I apologize for not recognizing you.
No, you didn't have to do that. It's been years.
Okay, so Nadia, I will turn it over to you. If you need to share anything, go ahead. And
all right. I will share my screen, so just give me 1 second. And I'll put it in. Are you guys seeing it?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. All right. I'm gonna get myself situated. Okay, so I, as you mentioned, am Nadia Opatz. My maiden name is Abu Ayed. My parents live in Big Lake, Minnesota now. The story is about my dad. So if you know him, he's going to be like, oh, great. My daughter's out here telling my story for everyone. Not true. He worked with me on finding all the pictures I'm going to share. So I'll talk about his story just to keep help you guys understand, like, this is a real person. This happened to lots of people, a lot of Palestinians. So it's one of many stories of Palestinians, but I think it helps ground us. And then I will talk a bit about what's happening today in the Israeli occupation, how the US is involved, even just hearing what you guys were talking about.
I heard audio.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, sorry. I thought I heard somebody. I'll talk about the US involvement, which gets a little bit interesting. I'm not an expert in this space. I'll tell you what I know. Feel free to ask questions, but there are things that are finally starting to be talked about to potentially be voted on for the kind of the first time ever. So I'll talk a little bit about that, knowing what this group is about, and then a little bit on how to support if that's something that interests you. I know some of you have seen a lot of this presentation, which is why I ended up here, but hopefully it will just stick a little bit more. Because I didn't change a whole lot just based on the outcome of that one. So with that, here we go. Agenda, and I will start here. So I'm going to just go page by page. There's a picture that we dug out from the few pictures that my dad has to help kind of put the story together. So this is my Jiddo. Jiddo means grandpa in Arabic. My dad is Jiddo to my kids. So that's a word for grandpa. My grandma, my 7 aunts and uncles were born in Palestine. They made a respectable living, owning and farming an olive and orange tree farm that had been in the family for generations. In 1948, they were forced out of their home as the alternative was to be killed. In an instant, they became refugees. This is my dad. He was born a refugee in a mosque in Lebanon. Certificate. He's unsure of his actual birth date and has no home to call his own. My family eventually ended up settling in a refugee camp in Tripoli, Lebanon. And when they all got there, they had a one-box room for all 10 family members. My family went from farming food for others to waiting in line to eat. They went from never thinking about running water and electricity to rarely having it. This is my dad with his mom. My dad was fortunate enough to go to school consistently, enough to receive a high school diploma. But as a Palestinian, it's quite hard to go to college because countries wanted their own to be educated before Palestinians. So you really have to think after 1948 of Palestinians as being second class, the way you think about how people don't want refugees in their country. All Palestinians at this point who have been kicked out are refugees. And so there is some classism that happens here within the Middle East for Palestinians versus the country that you're in. So not only was it hard to get educated, a lot of Palestinians didn't have enough money to actually go. Also underlined is who my dad is. Not that it really matters for you all, but just so you know. At 19, he left home and he moved to Libya due to the Lebanese civil war that was going on and to have a better chance at good work and education. So really at this point at 19 years old, his choices were to stay in a camp, find work while war was going on, or leave his family with the hope to make a better life for himself and also maybe provide for his family back home. So at this point, he's in Libya. Then a chance encounter at the Vienna, Austria airport. You can't make this up. My dad met this babe. This babe is my mom. And she was in Vienna. Sue gave me a great intro. She was in Vienna studying piano performance. She really is incredible at music. So she's at the top music university in the world, flying home to Rochester, Minnesota. My dad is flying from Libya to Germany to visit his sister. And there was a snowstorm and the rest is history. She saw my dad as a whole person and loved him immediately. And then I joked, I had posted this on the internet when things were going on back in May to help kind of tell his story. So that's what I'm using here. And so I also put in there also their style, which is spot on for the 70s. They got married and moved to Minnesota. They barely had $1 to their name, but my dad finished schooling at the University of Minnesota, earning an architecture degree. He visited Lebanon every few years. The background here, you can see, the reason I chose it, is the refugee camp around that time. I think this might have been the 80s. And so refugee camps, and I'll show a picture a little bit later, started truly as a camp with, here's some land, you get to stay here, tents, truly a camp. And then as time goes on, you start building with what you have. So things get built, but they're built not to code, not very good. And it's kind of like whatever you can get your hands on, that's what you try to get by with. So I actually never had the opportunity to meet my grandma. And this is the only picture I have with my jiddo. So this is my jiddo, my mom, and me. But I can't help but think with better access to life's basic needs, I would have had more time with both of them. Because think healthcare and any sort of support that way. So this is the camp, I believe, as of 2005. And much of my extended family still lives in and around the refugee camp 70 years later. So today, even if I call up my family, it is in a refugee camp in Lebanon. So again, this is a picture of 2005. The land reserved for refugees doesn't grow over time, even though the population does. So when you saw that last picture, everything was one level. So, again, it starts with tents, one level. And then now it just, you have to build up because you can't build out. So things are overpopulated, unsafe, electricity, you can tell, like, again, it comes in and out, but they don't really have any support from the government as far as like a lot of basic needs. Garbage is really hard, all sorts of things. So my dad has bullet wounds that have never been explained, stories of watching people die around him, has been thrown in jail for resisting ethnic cleansing, has had to leave his family in order to make a better life for his future family. These are unfair choices he's made. These are unnecessary injuries and injustices he has had to bear. I put it next to a really great picture. So this is a couple of years ago, but my parents with all of their grandkids. My dad isn't just a survivor, he is a superhero. His story is exceptional, which by definition makes him an exception. And this is a picture of him years later in front of the mosque that he was born in. And so what I kind of end this story with is, is that I hope to fight for a world where all Palestinians have the ability to choose to own their own land, have real choices, and the means to live freely. And that would be the norm, not the exception. Because when I tell my dad's story, whether it's to other Palestinians or to whoever, they're like, that's incredible. And it is incredible, but it's just like unfortunate that he's somebody who has gotten out, who has made it and has been successful and is able to help provide for his family. But again, shouldn't be the exception. It should just be the norm. So that's the background of the story. So with that, the history of Palestine is super, people say complicated. And so what I am trying to do now is explain, so where are we now? Regardless of what has happened thousands, hundreds, 70 of years ago, what is the conditions of Palestinians as it exists today? Because it is really upsetting, and quite frankly, US media, you don't get a lot of the real news, or if you do, you really have to dig and you have to like understand what headlines really mean. And so I'll explain some of that as we go through it, but I think this is a piece that's a little more educational, hopefully, and hopefully you'll learn something as we go through. I will go through a couple of slides, but it's a lot of information, so feel free to stop me, put questions in the chat. And if you want to just listen all the way through, I'll stop at certain points and check in too, if that works. So starting with just understanding Israel, Palestine, the conversation a little bit. So 1948 is the year my family got kicked out, along with 750,000 Palestinians. So a Zionist military force expelled at least 750 Palestinians and captured about 78% of the land. The last 22% was divided into different areas. They're probably areas you've heard of. So 1917, green is Palestine. 1948, you can see how it changes. This is all I could find that was visually really interesting, like and clear. This was what Trump was looking to do. Nothing here has actually happened. So we're kind of in this space right here. Zionism. I want to be really clear on what that is, because a lot of times we think about this as a Muslim Jewish issue. That is just not the case. This is a land conflict. Zionism is a little bit tricky because it's an international movement originally for the establishment of a Jewish nation. And so what they decided is Zionists decided that that Palestine is where that was going to be, and they had Britain backing them with military funding, et cetera, which is why it was able to happen. So I say that so you can be a Zionist and want Israel to be for Jewish people only. There are a lot of Jewish people who do not agree with Zionism. So I want to make that distinction, because that's where it starts to feel like, well, it's a religious issue. It is a very conservative Jewish view that they should have land to themselves. Palestine was one of a few countries that was looked at to be the Jewish nation. So they had looked at a couple other countries too, and then eventually with Britain decided this is what it was going to be. This had been in the works. I'm actually reading up on the history. This had been in the works since the early 1900s. It was after World War II where everything just like totally fell in their favor, which, you know, based on World War II, a lot of Jewish people were fleeing, and both the US and Britain were like, yes, we think that's really a good idea. Jewish people should go there. And so there was a lot of momentum because of what had happened historically to end up displacing my family and almost 1 million Palestinians after World War II. So that's a very quick, brief, again, history, but I just want to make sure that those kind of like definitions are clear. So 1948, we call the Nakba. That means catastrophe in Arabic. And so a lot of times you'll hear about 1948 specifically, because obviously that's where the biggest shift had happened. Today, Israel continues to force Palestinians in Jerusalem and the West Bank from their homes and lands, which are often taken over by settlers, which I'll talk more about as well. So when the 22% remains, I do want to mention it's the West Bank and Gaza Strip. So when you hear that, they are Palestinian territories. They're not a country. Israel still is like in charge essentially of what goes in and out of the land in green. And so they are controlled, Palestinians are controlled in a lot of ways in these spaces. So again, the locations, Israel's in blue, Gaza's over here. I do want to talk about Gaza a bit. So if you guys, I don't know if you'll remember this, but in May, Palestine and Israel came up a ton because there was some bombings going on. Anytime tensions rise, Gaza is what gets hit. It's really heartbreaking. There are 2.1 million Palestinians in Gaza. Gaza is 25 miles long and 4 miles across. It is tiny. So people refer to Gaza as an open air prison because it is 25 miles long, 4 miles across with 2.1 million people in it. And anything that goes in and out is all the Israeli military is all around it. Then you have the West Bank, which is a lot bigger, but there's 2.7 million Palestinians, and there's almost about 500,000 Israeli settlers who are not supposed to be there because you cannot settle as the country occupying in the land that you're occupying. I'll get into that too, but that's against international law to do that. And then East Jerusalem was meant to be for Palestinians. And as of right now, there's 345,000 Palestinians. There are almost half the population now is Israeli settlers. So according to Human Rights Watch, I'm going to just read this here. Israel, which calls itself a Jewish state, is committing crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution against Palestinians. So internationally, it is recognized that what's happening here isn't right, I guess is the best way to say that. Any questions so far? It's a lot to take in, I understand. Okay, so talking about Israeli settlements themselves. Settlements are Jewish communities built on Palestinian land. Again, there's about 600 to 700,000 Israelis living in settlements on the West Bank and in Jerusalem. They're illegal because it bans what I just sort of said is the Fourth Geneva Convention, which bans an occupying power from transferring its population to the area it occupies. Also, this is something to pay attention to. You will catch the US media calling forced expulsions of Palestinians from their homes evictions. So in May, all this stuff started bubbling up because they were forcing families out of their homes that they have kept for hundreds of years. And settlers were coming in, and the headline, New York Times, I mean, you name it, was there was Palestinian evictions. Evictions imply that you've like missed your rent. There was nothing that they owed anybody. It is their homes that they say either you leave or you pay $10,000 and we will take it down and you still leave. So it's really nasty. And so that was getting a lot of attention. People were fighting back, like, you can't kick these families out. They've been here for generations. This is not your land. We're an occupied land. And then tensions kept going. Violence started happening. And then that's where you got the bombing of Gaza. So that's a lot of like the background of what happened in May specifically. So understanding the occupation. So you understand settlements a little bit. It's not just about them taking over land in occupied areas. There are also road obstacles. There are 140 checkpoints to leave the Palestinian occupied territories. There are about 70,000 Palestinians with work permits to cross these checkpoints daily to be able to have jobs elsewhere. But they could wait for hours within these checkpoints. They have to travel along segregated roads. They have these things, it's so insane. They have these things called bypass roads that they're building. So like Route 60 here lies between two concrete walls. and only vehicles with Israeli yellow license plates are allowed to use them. So Palestinians cannot use these roads that connect and are fast highways. They have to use like the old roads that take forever, or they're not really connected to other big cities. And so the whole idea is disconnecting. When you think of oppression, it's separating the population. And so that's what a lot of these settlements do and these roads do, is allows Israelis to get back and forth really easily, but do not allow Palestinians to. There's a separation wall. This might sound really familiar to you. This is where Trump got the idea. Since 2002, Israel has been constructing a wall that is 400 miles long and 26 feet high. So not only did they construct this wall, they also didn't put it on the exact line of the land. They put it inside the Palestinian land, which is land that they could, in some cases, they could have farmed more. They cut off Palestinians to different social services and schools by doing it a certain way. And so literally there is a wall in the West Bank separating Palestinians from the world. The human cost between 2008 and 2021, the conflict has killed 23 Palestinians for every Israeli. I want to be clear, I don't think anybody should be dying. But I also want to mention numbers, because again, when you see the news, you see headlines, it always feels, at least here, of course, as a Palestinian, I feel like it feels like, oh, it's a conflict, you know, both sides. And 23-1 isn't both sides. That's one-sided. Somebody has a lot more power than another side, if that is the death toll. Not to mention down here, 120 Palestinians have been injured. And another 6,000 almost Israelis have been injured throughout this time. Of those killed on the Palestinian sides, which I think matters too, at least 1,200, 22% were children and 10% were women. Because you do bomb Gaza, there are too many people there that you can't, even if you could be precise, it can't be precise because it's so small. There's too many people in such a small area that they're going after, and they know this. On the Israeli side, 121, 48% of those killed were security forces as categorized by the UN. Again, this one's a gross one for me to share because it's not like I'm saying anyone deserves anything more. It's just that everybody deserves less than this sort of treatment, or better than this sort of treatment, I should say. And then I added this slide because while death and injuries are very important, there is something that has caught my attention the same way as I've been learning and studying more about the prison system in the United States, and how race plays into it. A similar thing is happening in Israel. So Palestinians are held in Israeli prisons. Palestinians, if they go to trial, are trial, jury, all of it, judge, all Israeli. So you can only imagine how that goes as far as who's being favored. There are currently 46 or 4,700 political prisoners held in Israeli prisons today. I think this was as of September. And Palestinians view them as political prisoners attempting to end Israel's illegal occupation. So essentially people who are trying to fight back. Let me make sure I get this right. Administrative detainees. So there's 520 people held without charge or trial. Meaning, let's say you're at a protest, they arrest you. You go into an Israeli prison. You can be held by the military renewably for 6-month periods without charge. There are people of these 500, there are people who have been in prison with no charge, no trial for over 2 to 3 years. If you ever hear of anyone, somebody just was on a hunger strike. This man was on a hunger strike for like 100 and some days, and he was a administrative detainee. So he didn't even know why he was in. And they just let him go after a ton of media attention and pressure on him. There are 200 child prisoners This is just really hard to read about. I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but enough said. And other things to note is throwing stones can be a crime that's punishable up to 20 years in prison. So the other thing is the punishment doesn't match the crime in a lot of ways too. So that is what I had on like sort of the today settlements, treatment of Palestinians. Do you guys have any questions there? Again, I know it's a lot that I'm talking at you.
Nadia, I have a question. So sometimes you hear about some Israelis, want to do this and others don't. Do you have a sense, is this strategy of oppressing the Palestinians in this way, is this broadly accepted in Israel? Is it 60% of the people? You have any sense of that?
I don't have a good sense of that. But I want to write this down because you're not the first person to ask me that. So I will find out at some point. What I would say is those who don't support Israel have a very hard time. So I don't know how honest people can be about it.
Mm.
So a great example, not quite the same, but silly, but Emma Watson, who played Hermione on Harry Potter, like famous British actress, she just came out in some way, social media, in support of Palestinians. And the backlash she received was significant. And then, but now what's interesting is since May, and honestly, I think the awakening that a lot of US people have had since Trump, since George Floyd's murder, I think there's a lot of people who are like, I can't really believe this over here and not care about the Palestinian cause. And so while she got backlash, there was a lot of support to say, it doesn't have to be one or the other. So I don't have a good answer for you, but I am hopeful that it's shifting a little bit I'm hopeful that the US is shifting a little bit, or at least those of us who are thinking harder about things like this and if it's fair or not. So I didn't answer your question, but I think it would be really hard to know for sure, but I also know that there are a lot of Israelis who are not supportive, but I wouldn't be able to put a number to that.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Wendy, did you have a question?
Yeah, oops, and my mute is not on. Okay. I have not studied the Palestinian and Israeli conflict a lot, but I, hear things over the news here and there. I'm just wondering if Benjamin Netanyahu was not in power of Israel, would things change for the better for Palestinians?
So he is no longer in power. He just switched this fall, and the person who took over is not necessarily going to be better. He is coming from the military. I can't quite remember his background. Holly, I feel like you can help me out here with all that nodding.
No, then when did Netanyahu? I thought he was still in power. When?
No, he got
recently.
out.
Oh, okay. Wonderful.
And the guy that took his place is even more like him.
Yeah.
He is really.
Yeah. So I wouldn't say we're I don't speak for all Palestinians. I can't speak for everyone, but I would say in general, the sentiment's not like things are going to get better. Which if I'm more than happy to answer more questions here, but I think you'll understand why Palestinians, regardless who was in charge, would think that. And a lot of it actually has to do with US involvement and the power that it has. So.
Well, do you think it's helpful that, there are quite a few people on the House side that are more accepting of Palestinian rights than there ever has been. And I don't know if that's going to help, but they were quite upset when they were trying to get the embassy changed.
Jerusalem.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
would
we're
say,
very vocal about it.
and I haven't kept tabs recently, but it's a handful.
Mhm.
Not many, but it's a handful. But it used to be 0.
Exactly.
So, you know, again, I have to be hopeful because the alternative is
Mhm.
this.
And they're also vocal.
It's also what?
They're also vocal, which is helpful.
Yeah. So we have the first US Congresswoman, Palestinian woman in Congress right now out of Michigan.
Mhm.
And so she's been super vocal, I would say, and she's part of the squad, I'm pretty sure. So the whole squad is super vocal on Palestinian rights. Betty, is it Betty McCollum?
From Minnesota, yeah.
She is the first person to try to get something, it didn't pass, legislation in favor of Palestinians and got a ton of backlash for that. So, but there are people, right? Like this is stuff that wasn't even a thought in a Palestinian American's mind that could happen. And so it's great, but it's also slow. I think maybe I should keep going and then we can talk more about this because this is the piece that you guys will probably connect with a little bit more, but it's hard to jump here without understanding the background. Okay, so here we go. Do you guys see it?
Yes. The US
Got it.
involvement, yeah.
Okay. Let's talk spending. We give Israel $0.3 billion a year in spending. We give other countries just over $2 billion combined. Egypt gets 1.3, Jordan gets hardly a $500 million, and then other countries here. So more military financing goes to Israel each year than every other country. Israel is not required to account for its expenditures. So it can spend in ways that contradict US policies. Why this is just because it is. Like there's actually rules against it and they still do it and nobody stops it. This includes using some money to build settlements in occupied territories, which is against international law. The US Department of State regularly reports human rights abuses committed by Israeli troops in occupied territories, and they're still giving the funding. And the Arms Export Control Act bars arms transfer, so essentially this money to any countries that are human rights abusers. But here we are continuing to give. Veto power is another place where Israel is able to kind of do what they want unchecked. The world is against this occupation. The General Assembly every year essentially votes to say immediate and complete, like stopping all Israeli settlement activities. Like this is not legal, they need to stop. And here are the countries who typically, which I'm surprised by Canada, I don't know enough about it, that say they're for pro-occupation. So essentially their continued support of Israel has stopped resolution condemning violence against protesters and illegal settlements in the occupied territory. Critics say, and so this is where I'm kind of talking like, our blanket support of Israel encourages a disproportionate use of force against Palestinians because they haven't gotten in trouble for it. And so just continue to do it and it continues to escalate and they get more bold in their settlements. And then what is actually slowing it down right now is social media and people being angry about it versus government. And so this disproportionate use, May was a perfect example. Their most recent bombardment of Gaza killed just this past May 219 Palestinians, which included 63 children, and that was May. And after this happened, that 3.3 billion we gave, Israel asked for almost another million, and we passed it. Congress passed it and gave them more money after killing 63 children illegally. So another place This is countries that have been essentially reprimanded. There's condemned by the UN. Those in black have been condemned and sanctioned because of something that had happened. So something came up, the UN's like, yep, we condemn that, and now we're going to sanction you as red is condemned but not sanctioned by the UN. The reason Israel hasn't been sanctioned is because of the US veto power. So the UN can say that's wrong, but they are not punished because the US vetoes it. So that's actually where I stop on kind of the US piece of it. I should add and will add more on like legislation. Nothing has passed, nothing's out right now that I could say go ask your congressperson to vote on that. But if there is, I'd be happy to pass that along. But this is sort of where we're at. And so as a Palestinian, an American Palestinian, it's just a very uncomfortable position to be in most of the time. The other thing I'll just add since we're here is, this is my last slide other than like, if you want to donate or how do you want to support or help. But one way you can help, or one way is just thinking about language. And if you see it, call it out or think twice about, is that headline really telling the whole story? And so you'll see a lot, the word clashes. Like in May, there was a lot of clashes between Israel and Palestinians. Well, when, you know, almost 100 children are killed, that's not a clash. Something is going on that's significant. And so what's really happened is colonialism is, and what the definition of that is control by one power over a dependent area or people, acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. Like that is the definition of what is happening. Conflict. Apartheid is always a tough word for some people because they associate it just with South Africa. I think there's been a movement to say it means inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression. And the idea of one domination of one racial group over any other racial group with the intent of staying in control. And so Israel has no intent, you know, it's like maybe they have no intent not to have control. They have no intent to come to the table and negotiate at this point. And they are systematically oppressing Palestinians. And that, again, the laundry list, I could talk about more. Water control, they control water, they control what comes in for food supply. COVID, oh my God, it's like vaccines. Israel was like the first country, you know, vaccinated to whatever percent. They're like the poster child for the world. Like, how did it work? Palestinians are barely vaccinated, but they could be, you know, so just everything you can think of, the answer is yes. Yes, they're being oppressed that way. Both sides, that one kills me. When you have all the power, all the money, all the military, it just can't be both sides. I wish it could be both sides. I wish Palestinians could put up a better fight than they can, but they can't. And evictions, I think we already talked about, they're full force expulsions. You are taking people out of their homes illegally. So again, just words to think about. And then the last one, I'm happy to send this to Sue if you guys want it. Some organizations you can donate to. This one's a little bit old, but I left it on here because if there is anything like this again, or you can send something to your representative saying stop sending aid, was one. This is no longer. And then the U.S. Campaign for Palestinians' Right is just a really good organization that has good up-to-date information. So that's probably the quickest way to just like learn things, see if you're interested in certain topics. They would do a much better job, obviously, than I would. yeah, so I'll stop there for now. There's also some books. I'm just starting to read more. I have small children, so that's just like not a thing I do right now, even though I would like to. But I could give some recommendations that way too, if academically you're interested in learning more of the history or whatever it might be. So a ton of content. Any questions, thoughts, conversation? Doesn't have to just.
I have a question for you about Ilhan Omar, our representative in Minnesota here, and
Yeah.
her criticism of the United States, and she got in a lot of trouble. I actually agree with her.
Yeah.
What she had to say, but she took quite a hit when she said that, and because there seems to be a lot of lobbying, a lot of money from Israel to the United States, and that was part of it. What do you, any thoughts on her or that whole thing?
She is an outspoken Black woman who Muslim, add all the adjectives. She's not going to win anything, which is really unfortunate. It didn't surprise me, would be my answer. I am so grateful she did say something. I am so grateful when anyone has the guts to do it. I can't help but notice most of the time they're women who are standing up for Palestinian government, point for women. So that is why representation matters, though, is as we continue to vote and think about people as having different perspectives. And so no, the response doesn't surprise me, but I hope that starts to change, or the backlash, because that's what happens all the time. Even I am quite serious about wanting to visit, I say Palestine. It might be hard for me to get in because if you looked at my social media, you'd have the picture of me holding up that sign for a protest. I don't actually post that much, but they would say, but you are pro-Palestinian. I don't know if I want to let you in here. You know, like you can't be outspoken easily for the Palestinian cause. What I am grateful for is that people are actually speaking out about it. Most of my life, it was silence. So I would say I am so thrilled to even have anybody speaking out. We would need more of it for anything to actually change, which is going to take a long time, because Zionism, this is what I'm reading about right now, you know, as Britain sort of fell after World War I and the US came into being the world power, Zionists were here already lobbying. And so it has been ingrained from the beginning, from the early 1900s, to support Israel and the cause of Zionism. And so that it's just going to be very hard to untangle, if we ever do. What else?
I heard years back about like what the solution would be a
Two-state.
two-state solution, right? And then I hear, well, no, that won't really work. What kind of vision, positive vision could I hold for this country, which is obviously, you know, just kind of a shit show right now, right?
Yeah.
So what kind of, you know, what should I pray for?
That's very sweet. I don't know that I have the answer, but for sure, take the oppression away. You know, for sure, allow people to live in peace. And that sounds so like, I don't know, too optimistic, but like walls, checkpoints, different roads, segregation. I mean, I just want to start with basic needs. That's honestly all I know right now, as far as like how to divide up land. That gets really complicated, right? Because then I'm also reading, as much as I said I don't read, I actually do. I'm reading a lot about the history of natives here. And there is so much that is similar. We are just hundreds of years ahead of where Israel and Palestine is. So I hope the outcome is different in that regard. So I don't know. Some Palestinians would say we want all of our land back. Some Palestinians would say two-state solution. Some Palestinians would say just leave us alone as is, so I think it depends. And that's why I think it's going to be really hard. I don't think it will ever happen as long as Israel continues to just have as much control as they do. No one's coming to the negotiation table in the first place. And so for me, the farthest I can think is stop oppressing us. And how do we stop having Israel from having so much power that they're able to do it so easily? Not a great answer, but that's where I stand.
No, thank you. That was a great answer.
Thanks. Anything else?
I have a question and okay, number one, I'm not on top of this subject by any means. Is there a group of Palestinians that are able to get things done or that are able to have a voice, and at what level do they have a voice?
Interesting you asked that. I'm not going to get the facts exactly right, but yes. And when they get powerful or enough traction, it just happened. There were 7 organizations that are now banned from being organizations in Palestine or Israel by Israel. And so anytime Palestinians start to get some attention, start to get some power meaning like attention, hey, look at what's happening here, it's taken away from them. And so there was a lot of uproar about the fact that sanctioned isn't the right word. I forgot what word they were using, but essentially we're like, you can't be in business here as a nonprofit. You are a threat to Israel. Like they essentially made them out to be, and that's like the prisoners, right? Like we're fighting for our cause and you can't fight for your cause. You're going to go to prison, right? So you just shut them up. So yes and no. There are some really good organizations, Palestinian led, as well as other, there's a lot of Palestinian, like the one I had on the US Palestinian organization, like that Campaign Rights does a lot of really good work, but a lot of the work is more around aid and human rights, not necessarily around government process that like we're not even to that point in a lot of ways. And there is a government, loosely a government that governs the Palestinian occupied territories, but they are in the pockets of Israel. So a lot of Palestinians are like, sure, you can say we have a government, but we don't really have a government. They're just listening to what Israel says. And so that's a point of contention too, is that those that are supposed to be taking care of Palestinians are actually being bribed by Israel. And so that's where you get, and I don't know a lot about this either, but that's where you start getting Hamas, who's like, screw this, nobody's doing anything. So we're going to go ahead and be intense about it, but then they are named a terrorist group. And I personally think that's up for debate when you're oppressed the way you are to actually want to fight back. But we don't recognize them as a group trying to form a government either. And I would say, myself included, wouldn't necessarily want Hamas to be representing Palestinians. But this is sort of what happens is there's people who try to get power. If they get power the right way, Israel kind of puts them back down, bribes them, or we call them terrorists. And so those are sort of our options as it stands today.
Nadia, do you live in the metro area, Minneapolis area?
I do.
Are you noticing more support amongst young people for the Palestinian cause?
I do. So that protest I went to, I've been to, enough of them in my time. We were downtown Minneapolis for 10 years. I'm now in Maple Grove, but when I went in June, there were 4,000 people there.
Yeah.
I think there maybe has been 200 people max at any other protest I had been to for the Palestinian cause. So I'm there, Hennepin Avenue, Uptown, Lake Street, like the whole thing. And at one point I was moved to tears because there was so much support. I was like, this is what a protest is really for. Like to actually feel it. I'm tearing up now even to feel it. Also realize that protests are so you can scream as loud as you want and you don't look crazy. So that felt great to chant along. So it was like the first time even for me personally as a Palestinian to be like, this is what support feels like. Because you have to understand for my childhood, like growing up, if I said I was Palestinian, there's kind of two things that happen. One, more common. I know I said this last time. They, I think, maybe thought I was Pakistani, didn't really know the difference. The other option was, I have a Jewish friend. And so then it was sort of like shut down. I mean, not said quite like that, but it was essentially like, can't do it. It's too complicated. It's too hard. And so I always felt very silenced. Like this, even me speaking like this is very new to me. And the fact that I feel comfortable, I think that comes with age, experience, all of that too. But I also think it comes from the fact that people like you actually want to hear and learn more about it. And so I feel an obligation to share that.
Yeah, I have my youngest son lives in Minneapolis, and he writes a lot of different political things, but has been involved in helping his Palestinian friends.
That's
and he
great.
also has Jewish friends too. That
and you can. That's the thing. You
and
can. That's the way it should be.
Actually, he's got two brother friends that are Jewish friends that were Russians, and they moved to Israel.
Wild.
And now they are in Minneapolis. And one of them is reviving Yiddish music, and she's really done a lot of wonderful work, but they're all sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, even though they're Jewish.
Yeah.
So,
well, that's what I'm saying. Being Jewish,
complex issue.
Being Jewish doesn't mean you're a Zionist. It's
Right.
like taking the most, any religion, the most, like my dad is Muslim. He is not ISIS. That's that'd be a totally fair comparison, but you get my point. Like the most conservative Christian person who shuts out everybody else is not all Christians. So like there's a spectrum of religion. And at the end of the day, this is taking people's land and oppressing a certain race, not religion. Like I'm Palestinian, but I don't identify as Muslim, but I'm a Palestinian and I do identify that way. And so that it's encouraging to hear that of your son's friends and your son. Yeah, Karen.
The US just seems to always be so beholden to the Israeli cause. It must be the people in power that have the money, that are sympathizers of the Israeli ties to Israel. Because like you said, I think if you, like the younger people are embracing the Palestinian side. I think Joe Biden even said he was for a two-state solution, and that was not on the campaign trail, right? And that was kind of glossed over and not popular. But if you follow the money, it's I suppose the corporations are funded, sympathizers of Israel, right? In the US. That must be a huge thing. Follow the money, right?
Well, also with evangelicals, the idea of we're Christian, we gotta save Israel. What? That doesn't even make sense. But they really support that idea,
Because is it salvation, like the Jews have to have their homeland back.
Because, you know, Jesus is in Israel and evangelicals have a very strong tie to Israel,
Oh,
which
okay.
again, doesn't make sense to me, but
Yeah.
they, not all, but a large percentage.
Yes, Jonathan?
Thanks, Nadia. This is one of the finest presentations on the topic that I've seen.
Oh, come on. Thank you.
Seriously, you know, because the attempt to make this a very confusing issue is been there for as long as I can remember. This has turned into a it's important to understand the history of this, because the United States has a very strong foundation in anti-Semitism. And after World War II, there were a whole lot of Jewish refugees, and they needed someplace to go. And the British community and the United States didn't want them here. And so it was easier to carve up somebody else's home and just give it to, give the Palestinian land to the Israelis.
There's a lot, again, I'm reading, it's called The 100-Year History of Palestine. It's so far really good. It's hard for me to read because I'm really trying to understand every single thing so that I'm able to get smarter. Also, it's hard for me to read because you know what happens and you're reading it happen. You're like, like this and that. But he touches on that it's a faraway land. We understand that people are going to suffer, but
it's desert land that people don't want. It was always painted as this land that was not desirable to be occupied by anyone, so we might as well let the Israelis have it. And after that, anytime anybody wanted to support the Palestinian cause, they were labeled as anti-Semitic. And that's not true. This is a matter of watching for fairness and seeing how people are treated. You can't occupy people, forcefully move them out of their homes and take away all of their rights. And as Americans, we've been stifled. And like when Emma Thompson, you mentioned her before, when she just simply says, listen, we need to do what's right here, she was labeled instantly as being anti-Semitic. And that is something that we have to resist. No, we're not anti-Semitic. We're just saying that there needs to be fairness and dignity for people who live in Palestine. But thank you very much, Nadia. It was wonderful hearing this presentation.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. One thing that I held on to, because the history is hard and rich and confusing, and you can get caught in one like, well, in BC, so-and-so, whatever, right? So you can find your way to whatever side you want. But I had listened to a presentation, this is probably back in June or July. Angela Davison was there. It was essentially, there is a huge allyship between Black people in America and Palestinians, because oppression shows up very similarly. So there's an alliance. And so while all this was happening in Palestine, there was a lot of the Black community saying, how can we show up? How can we support? And so I was listening to this thing, and she said, a tool to get you to stop talking, and this is what I felt most of my life, is to say, oh yeah, well, the history here. But really, she did a much more eloquent job than I'm doing. But really what she's saying is, if you know in your heart something isn't right, 63 children being killed today isn't right, that is true. And that needs to be fixed. It doesn't matter the history. I mean, the history matters, right? To be educated and to not do it again and to learn from it and all of that. But she's like, you can't say, well, in 1901, X happened, therefore this is fine now. It's like, no, you know it's not, what's happening right now is not right. And that's what you need to hold on to as you fight this cause, is because you know what's happening now isn't right. And that I have held on to that, because it's like, what a great way of like simplifying the most complicated of issues and conflicts by saying, but 63 children can't die in weeks and nobody stops it. You know, like that's not okay. And I think we're doing that a lot in the US too. Like, we can't just sort of say that's okay. So wise words from her.
So Nadia, as you look across the US, are there pockets where more Palestinians live so that they have more support? I was thinking about when you said you were at the rally or the protest in the cities as opposed to Maple Grove. Is it helpful to connect with the areas that are more populated? Do you find yourself reaching out, or?
I don't have a big Palestinian community, unfortunately. So Minnesota is not one of those places. So there's that. I found myself talking to my dad a lot. Now, my dad and I have a great relationship, but we don't chit chat on the phone. But I felt very alone, and I didn't, please take zero offense to this, I didn't want to have to explain it. I just wanted to complain. I just wanted to feel. And so I actually found a lot of help with my dad, and he kind of wanted to complain and bitch and feel, you know, and so we found each other, which was wonderful. Detroit has a really big Arab, Muslim plus Palestinian community. So Michigan is like a really big area. California is, New York is. Besides that, I don't really know. And honestly, there just aren't a lot of Palestinians, a lot of places other than the Middle East. I mean, there's obviously, we're sprinkled around the whole world, but as refugees, you kind of just go where you can and get out as you can. So, so while the rally, there was a lot of people there, I would say I was really impressed at actually the diversity that was there. There was a lot of Jewish, like people were being clear that they were Jewish at the rally. Do you know what I'm saying? There was a lot of white people, there was a lot of Black people, there's Somali, like you name it. It wasn't all Palestinians, not even close. And so that sort of diversity, even in that rally, was really uplifting. But no, I wouldn't say I have a huge community here at all. Actually, I should probably do a better job of that. Find my people.
You have a lot on your plate with small children right there.
Yeah, fair enough.
Are there other questions for Nadia tonight? Otherwise, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you. I did record it, and we will. I will send it out. I also want to make sure I get a copy of that last slide. So
yeah, of course.
Include that if people want to make contact or donate. Make sure that I get that. I'm just so impressed that you've taken this. So many people just would say, I don't have time. I care about it, but I don't have time. So the effort that you're putting into it, the reading that you're doing, and this coming out to different groups is so amazing. And I just thank you very, very much for your time.
No, I thank you guys for allowing me to come. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Before we go tonight, our next meeting is on Valentine's Day in February 14th, and we are going to be having Ellie Krug. Ellie is a transgender, and I don't know if you've had a chance to read this book, Getting to Ellen. It's her life story and her struggle to become who she needed to be, and the barriers, the obstacles that she found even within herself. It's a very moving book. And I think it's on Amazon if you'd like it. If you want to read it ahead of time, you don't have to, but it's quite interesting. Anyway, so she will be here in February. Other than that, I think that kind of wraps it up for tonight. It's good to see everybody. Stay warm, stay cold, just dress for the season, you know, it's Minnesota, right? We know how to do this, so.
30 above tomorrow.
Yeah, it'll be good. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here tonight, and yeah, take care.
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye all.